Welcome to episode number 25 of the On the Blue Line podcast. This is the interview room, and thank you very much for joining us. If you're watching this and you're seeing this on video, you're probably catching it either on Facebook or IGTV or, of course, our YouTube channel. So thank you very much for watching. This is just an interview. However, it's the beginning of some other videos and content that we'll be putting out in the days ahead. So I'm glad you're joining us here. Just know that the interviews are also available in audio pretty much anywhere you stream a podcast, from Spotify, Apple Podcast, etc. So this week, joining me for this interview is Ron Herman. He's a defense attorney out of Florida. He's got years of experience, including trial experience, been a few years in a prosecutor's office. And I know the first question you're probably asking yourself is, what's a defense attorney doing on a law enforcement podcast? Well, I think that's a great question, and I hope that by the end of this, you're going to see exactly why I thought this was an important matchup. I think that at the end of the day, though, yes, we may be on different sides of cases, that we all want the same thing. And that's what's so great about our constitutional system here in the United States. So I hope you enjoy this podcast. I hope you get something out of it. I hope you enjoy this video, and I hope that you're going to like, subscribe, and continue to follow us here at On the Blue Line. Thank you so much. Without taking any more time, here's my interview with Ron Herman. Well, Ron, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad we could finally connect. We've been trying to make this happen for a little while, and we were finally able to get our schedules together.
Yes, sir.
So let me ask you, I start with every one of my guests. Do you have a favorite? Is it coffee or tea?
My favorite is coffee, and I like a latte. So that would be my of those.
Really?
Drinks. Yes.
What got you? Is that because of the sugar side of it, or do you like more the designer side of it, or what brought you to the latte?
Probably more the designer side. I actually don't put sugar in my coffee, so it's just the espresso and the milk.
Okay.
It's the savory of it, probably with a little bit of the whole milk in it, and sitting down after a long day or a long, event to sit down and have a nice cup of coffee. That's kind of a soothing experience.
Well, and that answers my second question. I always like to ask your favorite place to have that drink of coffee. So
favorite place to have it would be, not a Starbucks. Starbucks is just fine, but kind of when you get to the non-chain, if you're on vacation and maybe there's like a specialty coffee place, there's certainly some in Miami that are non-chain, nice, good quality coffee. Those would be my most favorite spot to go have a nice cup.
I couldn't agree with you more. Do you have any best or worst travel stories?
I would say the worst travel story that I have, I was probably 11 or 12 years old, and I lived in New Jersey at the time, and it was my first time going on an airplane by myself. I was flying from New Jersey to Vermont to go to sleepaway camp, and it was about a 45-minute scheduled flight. And it turned out to be about 11 hours. We had to make 2 emergency landings. I remember one was in Albany. And like I said, I was 11 or 12, and this was, in 1985-ish. And, you didn't have cell phones and things like that. So there were concerns when they were saying we might spend the night and everyone's going to get a hotel room. And, I was old enough to realize, well, I'm not sure they're going to put an 11-year-old in a hotel room by themselves. Are they or are they not? So ultimately, we didn't have to spend the night, and we ended up getting to the destination just late that night. But that was probably the worst travel experience that I had. I mean, ultimately, everyone was safe, and I got to camp the next day. But a 45-minute flight turning into 9 hours is an experience, especially with the storms going around and 2 different emergency landings. So yeah, that was definitely an experience.
And that's the thing. Once it starts backing up in one part of the country, it seems like everybody suffers. I've been there as well. I've taken that 14-hour trip from here to Louisville, Kentucky before, from Florida to Kentucky. That should not take that long.
Right. It should be 45 minutes, wheels up, wheels down.
Exactly. So do you have a favorite place to relax and find peace? Maybe someplace that you kind of stop and enjoy life?
I would have to answer the gym, because busy work, busy activities, busy family life, going to the gym 3 or 4 times a week, that 1 hour, 3 or 4 times a week is a nice place to have alone time and concentrate on your thoughts, and obviously exercise as well.
Very good. Yeah, I definitely would agree with you. Do you just a conventional gym or CrossFit or anything like that?
Right now, I'm not in CrossFit. I was in CrossFit before I did some of CrossFit. I like the high intensity interval training, the HIIT
Yeah.
routines. So I can either do those there's a gym in my community that has a really nice equipment, or I'm also a member of LA Fitness, which you can go to as well.
Right.
The problem with LA Fitness though, if you're bouncing back and forth, if you're doing supersets, then when you move from one machine to the other, it's taken. So kind of, I like the smaller gyms.
Yeah, I go to Anytime Fitness. It's smaller gym, but it's the same thing. I get in there. There's only like 2 weight racks, so for bench work and so forth. So if you're doing that, like you said, you cannot leave that machine, or you're just not going to have it for another 2 hours.
Exactly. That's 100% correct. And then some people get upset. If you're doing rows on the machine in between, they're like, hey, can you go do that somewhere else so I can use the bench? So you have to go at off hours. But I would say that's your 3 or 4 hours a week of just time. And sometimes it's not even about just how much you lifted. It's just getting there and having some quiet and some alone time.
Sounds good. No, I couldn't agree with you more. So let me ask you, Ron, maybe just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do.
So I am 45 years old. My name is Ron Herman. I have a criminal defense firm that I concentrate on complex white collar cases, represent individuals in front of the United States Department of Justice, Securities and Exchange Commission, federal courts, state courts, all throughout Florida and obviously throughout the country as well. And it's important in my practice to help my clients navigate complex and stressful situations when they're under investigation by the government, which could be including grand jury indictment, obviously up into and including trials.
Very good. What drew you to law? What made you want to get into the practice of law?
I have always been interested in law and the criminal justice system. I was a political science criminal justice major. It has just always been something that was drawn to. I went to law school and then I became a prosecutor. I was a prosecutor for 6 years. I did 3 years in Broward County, Florida, and 3 years in Palm Beach County, Florida. I was the last couple years as a prosecutor here in Palm Beach County. I was in the specialized, they called it at the time, crimes against children. Now it's special victims unit, where obviously you prosecute individuals who are accused of sexual acts against minors and adults. I did investigations with law enforcement, worked closely with law enforcement. As a prosecutor, went out and did sex offender sweeps and locations, went on training courses for weeks up in Tallahassee on law enforcement property. So I've always been interested in that. And, being in the state attorney's office for 6 years, then you want to kind of expand your practice. And the benefit of what I'm doing now is I get to do a lot of different things. So I can do fraud cases, I could do money laundering cases. I go to different courts all throughout the state of Florida. I have cases from northern Florida to all the way down to southern Florida. And Florida is a big state with lots of different personalities and lots of different political persuasions and lots of different opinions. And it's interesting to see the dynamics in all of those different areas. Obviously I've been to Washington, D.C. in front of the Securities and Exchange Commission and have had cases in front of there and different federal courts throughout the country. So being on the criminal defense side certainly gives you the experience to open up the practice of doing a lot of different things, which I really enjoy.
That's great. Why and I'm just going to take this as a rabbit trail real quick, but when it comes to white collar crimes, as we had spoken before, it's something I worked at from a detective standpoint. What was your interest in that? It's the reason I'm asking is a lot of times when I teach white collar crimes to up and coming officers and to people coming into that career field, you always get that eye roll. You kind of get that's copious amounts of paperwork. Why would you ever want to do that? What draws you to the white collar crime side of it?
I think that's it. I mean, when you say there's a lot of paperwork, sure, nobody wants to sit and do homework all the time. But I think white collar crimes, basically it's theft. Someone is saying that someone stole or took money generally that they shouldn't have. But it becomes more complicated when you're talking about conspiracy and is there an agreement, right? Or you're talking about healthcare fraud, which is a big the federal prosecutors these days are going after healthcare fraud really strongly, and all throughout Florida. So when you're talking about healthcare fraud or telemedicine, and you're talking about a grand conspiracy that the government's alleging, well, what are the players and what do they actually do? So did the doctor give somebody an evaluation or did they not? Clearly, it's simple if you're saying a prescription was written without a doctor seeing a patient, whether it's virtual or in person. I think everyone would agree that that's problematic. But when it comes down to the salespeople or different leads or different individuals who knew or did not know maybe that the prescription was being written in such a way, or how anti-kickback statutes work, I find that a fascinating area of law, and I think that sometimes people, obviously not sometimes, but people need very strong representation because the government comes at them very strong, and they need to fight that zealously.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, and I don't disagree with you at all. And I find when it comes to white collar crime, that's exactly what I like about it as well, because there is overwhelming these paper trails, this information all exist, and there is that line between civil and criminal. And that's part of our job as investigators, is to follow that evidence and to try to determine, like you said, is this clearly a case where they knew or should have known, or is this a situation where it is really more on the civil side of the house?
And sometimes it really is subjective. It's not an objective determination in a lot of scenarios. So, if you arrest somebody and there's drugs on the seat, okay, there's drugs on the seat. I mean, someone can say it's mine, it's not mine, and you have those arguments, but it's objective. There were something, illegal here, right? If there's a contract where two people are entering into a contract with some complex terms, is it civil or is it criminal? And sometimes law enforcement's not sure and a jury's not even sure. So then should that be something that's brought in a criminal case, if in fact the interpretation of that is so widely could be looked at either way, then maybe that's something that shouldn't be brought to a criminal, especially since the government has the burden beyond a reasonable doubt. And maybe that's a case that should be better suited in civil court. And I'm not saying perhaps there's not a wrong that has been done, but is it a criminal wrong? Is it technically non-compliant? And is it technically non-compliant in what arena and under what statute? And sometimes those things are really, really interesting to discuss with clients.
No, very interesting. I find it equally as fascinating. So to that end, let me ask you, there's kind of this, I know when we first sat down to have this conversation, there's kind of this stigma, at least among law enforcement officers, that defense attorneys are quote unquote on the other side, that we're not necessarily enemies, but that, it's, there's some controversy there. We're not on the same side like you are with the prosecution. That being said, how do you see the role of a defense attorney or the defense in general in our constitutional system?
I think that the role of the defense attorney is probably one of the most important roles in the country, as far as in the criminal justice system. It is the individual being accused of a particular crime and somebody making sure that they have due process rights, that they have the Constitution applies to them. Even the worst offenders are entitled to that. And that's what makes our country great. And that should not be something that is opposing views. Law enforcement, criminal defense attorneys, and criminal prosecutors should all agree that there should be proper representation. There should be proper examination of witnesses. The system is designed, whether you like it or not, that they would rather have guilty people free than any innocent person in prison. And that's just a setup of our system. And just, if you think about that, that's incredible, because the country and the Constitution cares so much about not putting an innocent person in prison. And I think it's a very important job to concentrate on and to educate the public, because law enforcement, from my perspective, and criminal defense attorneys and the criminal defense bar should be able to get agree. And a lot of times you have common goals. I mean, there are times when there needs to be a turn-in. If I'm calling law enforcement to arrange a peaceful surrender, that helps everybody, right? That means nobody has to pull out guns on anybody on the street. No citizen needs to be fearful, or the law enforcement doesn't need to be fearful. If it's simply, let's walk in at this particular time to this particular office, and we'll go through the booking process.
Yep.
I think that that's certainly beneficial. There's also times, being a former prosecutor, sometimes you feel that. So when I was a former prosecutor, as a prosecutor, if I needed to review evidence or call the sheriff's department to get a video, you're treated like gold, right? Oh, Mr. Herman, let me connect you right away to the evidence department. We'll have an officer bring that over to your desk today. Is that okay? I'm like, I don't even need it today. I mean, a couple of weeks is fine, but I'm just calling to get it. Now I'm the same person. I'm the same human being now, calling to get that same evidence as a defense attorney. And the walls that you get calling to get that evidence, it shouldn't happen that way. Right. I mean, I'm entitled to the same evidence as the same officer of the court. And when you call up and they're like, well, let me check with this, let me check with this, you need a court order. Some of that is unfortunate in my opinion. Some of it should be equal access and equal to view evidence. And sometimes it's great. I had a case, it was just a couple of days ago, where I had to go view evidence at the police department. And the detective on the case was just absolutely wonderful and courteous, and met me and goes, I'm here, we're good, good talking to you. We talked about working out a little bit too, looked at the evidence. Everybody wants to win when you're in the courtroom, and that's normal. But the procedure of looking at evidence and inspecting the case, that should not be contested to some degree. I mean, obviously there's things that are contested, but some of it should be smooth and transparent.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you at all. And I think, so I know a lot of times with newer officers, when they come in and, they'll go through that first deposition or whatever, and they'll come back and it's like, oh, they're just out to get the, to get the guy off or whatever. And that's why I'm glad you answered that question. I like the way you answered that question, because it's important to educate, like you said, not only the public, but also law enforcement officers, especially guys new in this career, because, and I will say, it's a little intimidating. The first couple of depositions you go through, some of the questions you're going to be asked, some of the things that are going to be said, you're going to be like, well, hold on a minute. I was just trying to do my job. And, now I feel like I'm the one on trial here. That feeling will come in some situations. But to understand the broader system, and like you said, the way that our Constitution is set up, because it benefits all of us, because Lord forbid, if I'm ever in that situation, I'm glad we live under the Constitution we live under.
Right. And I think that's exactly it. I think if you're ever in that situation, with all the points that can be made, when people make points in law enforcement, a lot of times, I feel it's similar to political points. They take extreme examples that are either totally support their position, or are horrific, on the horrific examples. And those are certainly points to be made, but I think a lot of it is doesn't have to be on the extreme. There's a lot of examples that aren't to that extreme, So, the same thing with political examples today. If you could kind of, and I tell my clients when we're going over the case, you don't have to agree with the prosecution's theory of the case. You could dislike it, but you have to understand it and you have to appreciate it, because the prosecutor and the law enforcement are bringing their case, and this is the elements that they need to prove, and this is their theory. And, so it's not being mad at it, it's not dismissing it. You have to appreciate it and then say, why are they wrong? Why are they incorrect in what their investigation and theory was? And how do we show that? And can we show that to the prosecutor early on to stop the process? Or is this a case that we need to go to trial and show it to a jury?
Yeah. No, very good. I like that. And I think it's such an important part. And I think it's something that's so often misunderstood.
Especially if you think about it, one example to that I think is maybe for your audience is that, I'm going to change it around a little bit, obviously, but I have a client who is a police officer, and he was accused of a crime, not a very serious crime. All crimes are serious, but in the realm of it, it's not the most serious crime. The balancing act is internal affairs, right? Mm-hmm. Want the officer to, they're using the word cooperate, right? And give the story of what occurred. However, that may not necessarily help the criminal defense of the case, right? So that's a fuzzy area, right? So if you're that person accused of the crime, right, then you understand your constitutional right and that your right to remain silent in the criminal case, but then also you would understand your bosses and internal affairs and wanting different answers to different questions. And I thought about that case and preparing for it today, because I think it's one of those things that in different scenarios, who's, the righteous individual and who's not, right? Kind of like in that movie Crash, if you saw that, right? Like
Yes.
sometimes you get this person who is just wonderful in one setting, but in another setting, a criminal or a bad individual. Not a bad individual who maybe made a wrong choice.
Right.
So I think that those are interesting scenarios. Another one is I was involved in a case where local law enforcement was alleged to have, and this is probably like 10 years ago, before everybody had body cameras or before they were as prominent as they are now. But local law enforcement was accused of using too much force on a suspect, and FBI was investigating. And this was probably some time ago. This might have been like 15 years ago. But for me, as a young lawyer at the time, I found it interesting that local law enforcement didn't want to cooperate with the FBI's investigation. So it's all law enforcement, right? Everybody is a law enforcement officer, but now you have conflict. You have the FBI wanting to investigate and take statements from these individuals and get the helicopter footage of what occurred. And you have local law enforcement disagreeing with FBI. So depending who you represent in that case, right? If I'm a lawyer for the FBI, I may have one particular theory. If I'm a lawyer for a particular individual on that local law enforcement level who is alleging not to have done anything or not been involved, then that's a different path you're going down. So I think these type of cases that aren't your extremes on either end, that are a little bit, closer to the middle, would be important, discussions, and for your audience to think about, when they're out there, making arrests and interacting with the community, accountability, transparency. Those things are obviously key words, and I think very important. And make everybody's do their job easier.
Absolutely, it does. A couple points that you made. When we talk about the IA investigation and then we talk about the criminal investigation, like you pointed out, there is clearly, and we all know, being in law enforcement, being no matter what your role is, what you should do if you're being accused of a crime, because you have the right to remain silent. You have, we go over these things over and over again. And yet, like you said, when you're looking at also the possibility of an IA investigation, many times there's no due process whatsoever, what I'm seeing anecdotally, when it comes to the agency or whatever side of it. What is your thoughts on that? Because I would think in the broader argument, there still should be some level of due process. However, you're talking more of an employment situation where there isn't a right to work and so forth. So what are your thoughts kind of on that dichotomy?
I think they're both important, and they're tough decisions. And sometimes you have to make tough decisions. And I've had cases even taking it outside of law enforcement where not even the person wasn't a police officer, but just a business individual who their own, whether it's internal affairs or whatever the company calls it, the same individuals wanted to talk about what occurred and what was alleged. And then you have to make a decision. Sometimes the decision has to be, like what you said, there's no right to work, right? So if you want to not make a statement, and I think there's a good chance of success on your criminal case, right? That's one path we're going to decide to go down. Or do you make a statement understanding that could have significant penalties in your criminal case, but then what's the benefit in your job? Are you going to be able to keep your job now? Are they going to fire you anyway for giving that statement if they don't like what they hear? So a lot of times it comes down to choices. And I think that liberty is somebody's most important right. And I'm a big proponent of due process as well. So, certainly I would probably most of the time advise my client in the criminal arena that, the right to remain silent is sacred and that may be the route to go. Every case is different, and every case needs to be examined differently. But, if your choice is between going to jail or losing your job, I think most people probably know what choice they were going to make in that situation.
Right. Very well said. When we talk about accountability, just kind of as a segue here, one of the things we wanted to touch base on today is the role of body-worn cameras in law enforcement. What are some of your, let me start with just a broad question. Do you think that the camera does improve police interactions with the public based on what you've seen on your side of the house?
I think yes. I think in the current climate today, and law enforcement is under extreme scrutiny. I think that body cameras help everybody. I think they help police officers to show the behavior. I think they also should help police officers point out what they're calling bad apples, right? I mean, there is this expectancy and to be expected for police officers. Should there be bad apples, other law enforcement officers should be able to be comfortable and talking to their supervisors about that. So I think that wearing these body cameras, I think they only help everybody. I think they help the individuals. I think they help the officers. I think the scrutiny that, like I said, that law enforcement is under, I think is very important. I mean, there are, you're probably aware that, in Palm Beach County right now, for example, there's local leaders and activists on all sides have been getting together, and they're holding numerous police forums about these type of things, about community police reforms, about body cameras, and how those can help the community. So I think that during the current climate, that it can only be beneficial.
Yeah. I don't disagree with you. In fact, so when I started, we did not have body-worn cameras. However, it's something that came in later. And as with all things in law enforcement, nobody wanted them because nobody likes change. Everybody wants to resist change. However, what I found most interesting, and again, anecdotally speaking, was once we got the cameras, how much it did to actually decrease citizen complaints. Because a lot of times you'd have citizens call up and say, I want to complain about so-and-so or say such and such. And really the supervisor in the beginning would only need to say, well, just so you understand, I'm going to first review the body worn camera and then I'll address your complaint. And many times it'd be like, well, I want to withdraw what I was saying. Never mind. So that would happen quite a bit in those beginning days before it became a talking point that everybody realized we had them.
So, I mean, I think the benefit of that though outweighs so if somebody's calling to make a complaint about a police officer, and maybe that's a frivolous complaint and that particular complaint didn't have strong grounds to be made, and then there's a camera that takes that complaint away, I think that the benefit of having them outweighs that, because I think that if law enforcement is acting properly and doing everything correctly, then I think it's just going to document that. I have a case now that I'm actually litigating, and during an important part of the investigation, the officer turns the body camera off, the sound. I think in today's scrutiny, a jury will very much dislike that.
Oh, yeah.
And I think to your point, it's funny that the words that you use, you said that you don't like the things to be changed. In the Palm Beach Post, there was actually an article, and it was Delray Beach, Boynton Beach chiefs begin discussions on community policing reforms. And one of the earlier quotes is, and this is by Boynton Beach Police Chief Michael Gregory, getting law enforcement officers to accept police reform is not an easy task. And then he quotes and says, this is his quote, "There are two things police officers don't like, the way that things are and change," end quote.
Yep.
So that's
so true. Yeah, we're that is absolutely true when it comes to law enforcement officers, and it doesn't matter what it is. Like, it could be something very benign, something very simple that's not that big of a deal. Like, hey guys, we're just simply going to use this form instead of this form, and there's always going to be grumbling. There's always going to be, well, we've been doing it that way. It's like, so you got to always, well, this is how it's going to make your life easier. Just work with us here. But
yeah. I mean, that's the same for a lot of different areas too. I mean, I have friends obviously in contract law, and they, become in-house counsel for a firm, and they're like, well, this contract needs some changes. And their boss is like, this is the contract we've been doing for 35 years. And well, just because you never got sued on it doesn't mean it's correctly. I mean, so we need to, so someone else comes in and says, okay, let's make some changes to these clauses in the contract. But right.
Yeah, maybe you've just been lucky for 35 years. Let's not let that run out.
Right, or because someone takes a look at it and is aware of that. Obviously, in my opinion, I think you should take those changes and make them.
From what you've seen, do you have any examples when it comes to body worn camera and kind of how it has developed within cases? Is it usually a good thing? Is it kind of a mixed bag? And when I say good thing, is it more specific for the defense, for law enforcement? What have you kind of seen, if you can talk in just broad strokes?
I mean, I have probably maybe two examples. One where it was good for law enforcement, and then one where it was good for me. I mean, and I think that's probably common. I think that that's kind of the whole idea of these cameras, is that I think that they capture what happened. Now, sometimes, obviously, they're from different perspectives or different point of views, or just don't capture the beginning, or maybe just capture a particular angle. And there still needs to obviously be scrutiny. The camera can't just be, this is the witness for all events. I mean, but it certainly can supplement. But I had a case once where intoxication was involved, and when you read the report, it said that the client was cursing and making derogatory statements, and the client told me, and obviously again I'm changing it a little bit for confidentiality purposes, but the client something like told me that these statements weren't made. I swear on my mother's life that I never said this. I'm like, and similar to what your point was earlier, I'm like, great, well, let's order the video and let's show that this didn't occur. And unfortunately, in that case, the video was pretty consistent with the report. I've had other cases where I actually got a whole case, several dismissed on more than one occasion, where you read a police report and it says, the red car turned right, then left, and when the person got out, dropped their keys, put the bag on the top of the car, and then did this, and then did that, and then you're watching the video, and it's almost like you're watching a completely different incident. You're like, wait, none of this even occurred, and you're literally, okay, so the car didn't make a right, and not that the right or the left is the biggest issue, but when you're going to just paragraph 1 of a report, and on the first page, you have 11 things that you're watching the video that just did not happen. The purse was never put on the car. The keys were never dropped. The person never made that statement to you. It's just untrue, and not being, it's just false, no other way to say it. It's just untrue. It's false. It didn't happen. And then you show those videos to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor just agrees with you right away and says, there's no even dispute. I mean, I'm watching the same video you are, I'm reading the same report that you are, it's just clearly untrue.
Right.
And then you're able to get obviously a good result for your client. So in those situations, the cameras are wonderful, because then if you think about it, when I started, there were no cameras also. I was a young prosecutor in 2000, I guess 20 years ago. And then was a problem. We never had cameras. I mean, you tried DUIs with no cameras. You tried trespasses with no cameras, stealing from the CVS with no cameras. And it was simply just the clerk or one officer saying these things happen. And you won cases. I mean, that's how it was 20, 30 years ago, right? Now the juries, as they should, expect cameras. And they make a big difference, because when these things don't happen, what would have that case, in that case, the example of the 11 things that were just not accurate in watching the video, if I went to trial on that case, it would just be my client's word against the police officer's word, right? Yeah. And no video. And that's a difficult situation for a client to be in, even when you're in the absolute right.
Yeah. And that's not something any of us want, even from the law enforcement side of the house. Like, to me, those kind of stories just, I don't know, they irritate me because, like you said, that's, none of us would want to be in that position, because unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm going to say fortunately, because I think it is important that there is a certain amount of trust that's put into law enforcement. But the reason that is there is because of integrity and because of being held to a higher standard. So when that erodes, that jury has no way of knowing that officer is, I would hope unintentionally, but probably intentionally, misleading or saying some things that were not accurate. And then sadly, like you said, if it's just the officer's word versus your client's, they're more likely to take the word of the officer, which I think is a good thing as long as it's rooted in integrity. That's what makes that so important and why it's something that an officer cannot lose in their career.
I agree with that. And I think there's been a change, I would say, over the 20 years that I've been doing this in what, in that example, juries, when I first started, I felt would probably, every case is different, but I think when I first started, juries maybe did give police officers some benefit of the doubt in their testimony. I think the climate has changed a little bit.
Absolutely, it has. I think we can all agree on that. So, to that end, and you kind of touched on it a little bit, and I just wanted to, the way I was going to ask the question is how much weight should be given to video in general, just when it comes from the idea that, like you said, it's usually from one perspective. It's usually like, it's not all encompassing. Even with a body worn camera, you're typically only talking, like, depending on where they wear it, if they wear like a headpiece or they wear like a chest piece, you're only going to get this view. So depending on what happens and where it occurs from the direction they're facing, everything could be off camera. So how much weight should be given to video in general, in your opinion?
So I think every case is probably different depending, like what you're saying, where a video shows, what a video doesn't show, and what the angle is. But that being said, a video in some cases should be treated just like any other piece of evidence. You can find evidence that agrees with that video, conflicts with that video, or disagrees with that video. And the jury is allowed to make their opinions about that, just like all the other witnesses and all the other evidence that would be presented to them. I don't think that you should solely rely on one particular piece of evidence generally to make that conclusion whether something occurred beyond a reasonable doubt. I think it certainly is an effective tool. I think it certainly these days is expected, as should be expected in many, many places. And I think sometimes juries understand that, you know, maybe in some business that is off the main street, maybe there isn't a video. But I also think that juries expect and should expect that in a police car these days, or at least on a police officer, there should be a camera. And if there isn't, then I do think that responsibility lies on the moving party, which is the government or the state, and they're bringing forward the case to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And this is now 2020, and I don't think the video was full, or I didn't download it properly at the end of the evening. I don't think that those are valid reasons anymore, and I think that those could be problematic with the case. That doesn't mean that the state should just disregard a case if, in fact, those things occurred. Right. But I think obviously it's a big responsibility to bring a case forward and put somebody's liberty on the line. And I think they need to make sure, the government needs to make sure that if they're doing it, they do have the evidence. And if not, then it needs to be addressed pre-trial. But to answer your question is, yes, I think that the jury or prosecutors or defense attorneys should rely on other pieces of evidence as well.
Yeah, no, definitely agree. And to that end, just so you know, well, and I'm sure you do know, but also so my listeners know, there is lots of policies. Like there's a quite lengthy policy that governs how body worn cameras are used and addresses many of the things that you just mentioned. And it has very stiff penalties if officers don't do it. So those excuses such as it wasn't working, it wasn't uploading, it's technology, those things happen, but there's a very set process as to how that has to be dealt with, who you have to notify, the time frame you must do it within. And that way this doesn't become something that happens all the time and the video conveniently doesn't upload or whatever the situation may be. Because even if the person didn't do anything wrong, sadly, there's always that stigma if it does inadvertently happen at just the wrong time. So there is clear policies that address these things.
Sure, as there should be, and the policies should be addressed and readdressed and spoken with, community leaders, and I think that's important to go into the transparency and relations with the community as well.
Yeah. To that end, though, when we talk cameras, there's also the witness side of it as well, right? I mean, a lot of times witnesses can be brought forward in cases, and due to things like witness bias, due to a lot of other issues, the witnesses themselves could be problematic to a case that's going forward, correct?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think there's studies that have been done where somebody like wearing a green shirt walks into a classroom of 200 students, maybe like, let's say, a green shirt with a red hat, right? And the students weren't expecting that person, and someone runs in and just like one, and then runs out.
Yep.
And then they ask each of those 200 students describe, what clothes the person that just ran through that classroom was wearing. And what did I write down? Green shirt, red hat. So, I mean, that should be the answer from 200 people, right? And I don't have the studies here with me today, obviously, but
Right.
but people get it wrong, and a lot of people get it wrong. They're saying, oh, it was a yellow hat, a blue hat, it was jeans, and a yellow tank top, and so yes, I mean, eyewitness testimony is certainly suspect and certainly should be cross-examined and certainly should be looked into. And people look at things differently and people digest things differently. So I think that's the benefit of trial and cross-examination, which I think is, going to trial obviously has its downside, but I think it's certainly one of the greatest ways to get the citizens of the community to be involved in the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
There was a judge that used to, during the voir dire process, during the jury selection process, used to say that other than, picking up a gun and fighting overseas in an army of some degree, this is probably close to the greatest thing you could do in your country, to sit here for a couple of days and be on a jury panel. And I don't disagree with that. I think that, fighting in a war like that is not for everybody. And some people don't get picked to be on a panel. But if you are, I do think you should take it seriously. And I don't think it's just, and I think it's something that it is one of the greatest things you should do for your country.
I agree with you. We're so blessed to have these. And it wasn't until I got into law enforcement and started seeing kind of how the system operates on all sides that I really began to get that appreciation for it. Because growing up, I never really had any, thank God, I didn't really have much involvement with the criminal justice system. So it was just kind of one of those things that happen. Well, if they're saying the bad guy did it, bad guys should go away. That kind of thinking, which is very naive. I understand that. But it's interesting as you get older and you kind of understand the system and how it works and you start getting these different perspectives. And on that witness thing, I just want to touch on that real quick, because it wasn't until I started teaching like photo lineups and photo packs and so forth, and doing, well, even the changes the state made about a year ago with photo packs and with the requirements, that it really began to show how problematic witness misidentification really can be and is, and how little people realize. And I know you referenced some of the videos, which I may link up in the notes for some of our listeners who are listening. So Ron, just real quickly, I want to go down the road of part of what you do, and you referenced it earlier, is defending law enforcement officers. Can you speak a little bit about that and some of the cases that you've had? And
Sure. I mean, so I think I touched on, I kind of brought one in earlier, the idea of the law enforcement officer, making the decision of how to deal with the internal affairs investigation. And those are certainly important. There's also, law enforcement officers that I have that have been accused of certain wrongdoing. I don't want to get into specific facts necessarily, but wrongdoing. And then you're talking to, some of the wrongdoing would be financially. Having some financial, interest in a case or means in a case that they shouldn't have. And, those are obviously cases that what you need to do is have the initial consultation with the client as far as what are we looking for the outcome, right? I mean, and that's important sometimes when you're meeting with a client is this a case that you want to go to trial? Is this a case that you want to try to resolve? Is this a case that they have it wrong on? And those are important conversations, especially when you're a law enforcement officer, because the training and being on the job is an important part of who you are and what you've done and the interest that you have. And if there's a offense that takes it away, those need to be investigated seriously. And so other than the cases that I mentioned earlier, I don't know, those would be the two cases that I had that I kind of wanted to talk about today.
Yeah.
The other one was the FBI investigation that we talked about with local law enforcement. So should those local law enforcement officers or your audience listening make the determination, are they going to cooperate at a grand jury? Are they going to be witnesses for the government about other individuals who maybe treated somebody with force. And again, I think over time things have changed, and I think now that's probably much more accepted and significantly appropriate, and the way it should be. Where if in fact officers are on the street and notice something incorrect, I think now there's a desire to correct that and to say something, and as I think there should be.
I agree with you 100%. And I do think that that's maybe swayed. There's that whole, what they say at the blue wall of silence thing or whatever, the old terminology that they would use. And a lot of that has changed. And a lot of it, I think, too, a lot of factors. We both happen to be in the state of Florida, where we're not really a union state. I mean, we do have an FOP and so forth, but there really isn't any teeth to the union in Florida. So
no, and I've done some of those cases. I mean, those are some of the cases that I've worked with the unions as well, and done some of those cases as well. And I think those are, those are very interesting cases, and they have a lot of those issues that come into play as far as, getting your pension if you resolve a case a certain way, right? Your retirement back. So those are, it's not always just did the person, and this is for everyone, I mean, but for law enforcement specifically as well, sometimes it's greater than did the person commit a wrongdoing or technically non-compliant with a particular statute, right? It's, well, is there a path to move forward with that person's life, right? And I think that's important that you need to analyze when you take on a case.
definitely agree with you. Something I want to touch on real quick, and you can give maybe your thoughts on it. A lot of times when we talk about the bad apples, quote unquote, as you had said, or people that make bad decisions in law enforcement. So you have an officer that has a history. And I know in some of the large headline cases, they'll be like, well, this person had 15 prior uses of force, or they had 17 IA investigations or whatever. That in and of itself doesn't necessarily show the whole picture. And I want to be clear about that, at least in my opinion, that somebody can have, depending on the area they work in, depending on what they've done within the agency. If there's somebody that is on maybe a special unit that's constantly doing task force type work, maybe they're out serving warrants a lot, maybe they're doing a lot of narcotics type stuff, they may have a larger number of uses of force. They may have a larger number of cases that are even investigated at an IA level in which they haven't done anything wrong and they've been vindicated. And none of those cases were sustained. So is that not possible, where you could actually have a good officer and yet they still have quite a few cases that have been brought forward just due to the nature of the type of work that they do?
I think that I would agree with that. I think what maybe would be a distinguishing factor that you would want to look into it is, so like, for example, when you're saying use of force, are the complaints similar, right? So is it this person grabbed my neck, this person grabbed my neck? If it's everyone saying my neck was grabbed in a technique that shouldn't be grabbed, even if each instance called for use of force, and looking at each one, the use of force, was determined to be appropriate, but the complaints are still similar, then I think maybe there's something to be said about investigating and maybe educating that particular officer that while there's not findings of fault, is, I think in your example, maybe there's some different training and different techniques that can be used.
Right.
If there's pulling a certain, race over and that, hey, I got, and each individual time was cleared or sustained, as you said, but still, if there's a pattern. So I would say that would be a distinguishing factor to look into. So I would agree with your statement that that doesn't necessarily mean that there's fault. What would concern me would be if there's a similar pattern of similar type of behavior. If they're all just different random type of incidences, then clearly that's one way to look at it. But I think if there's a pattern, I think that's something that could be questioned.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with you. I just like to point that out because obviously that's something in our modern world, is something a lot of times that gets grabbed on by media or social media, and you'll see these things splashed across there. And I think it's important that people take a moment, and like both of us need to do in our jobs, you take a moment, you consider all the facts, and you consider the relevant, what all is here in this bigger picture, and what does that have to do with the incident that I'm looking at. So Ron, we're getting a little bit short on time here. A question that I kind of ask everybody is, what is one thing that law enforcement officers can do to help in their personal lives? Do you have any thoughts along that line?
So in personal lives, I think as a prosecutor and as a former prosecutor and as a defense attorney, I mean, in the personal lives, I think you need to obviously have an outlet and a hobby that kind of lets your mind wander. Again, when I was a young prosecutor, I think someone said that some of these jobs kind of get to your soul. Whether you're on a police officer, law enforcement prosecutor, or defense attorney, you see things that some people don't see. I mean, I'm in the courtroom almost every day. During non-COVID times, almost every day. But generally, we're in the courtroom a lot, and you see, someone's child be sentenced to prison for 30 years, and the mother fall on her knees, crying. And whether you believe, that sentence was right or not right, there's still compassion for that mother who lost her child. And, same thing, there's, like I said, you can think of examples on every particular spectrum. So I think you need to be able to go to the gym if that's what you're interested in, right? I mean, cooking, if you're interested in cooking, I like cooking. I think that's a good hobby. Golf, baseball, things that kind of like, let your mind wander a little bit. I also think transparency, and I put that down when I was looking at this question here. Trust and transparency and relating to their community. And I know that's not necessarily personal lives, it kind of rolls into professional, but I think relating to the community is important, right? Being involved in different community events, maybe being involved in community events that aren't necessarily your expertise, right? So if you're I'm involved a little bit into local government. I mean, if you're a police officer, sure, a lot of cities have public safety that work with the villages or the city that you're in. There's also different, parks and rec. There's planning and zoning. There's placement of trees in some different communities. And that's involvement in the community, but on a different thought process than what you do every day.
Yeah. And the people that you'll come into contact with are going to have different thought processes as well, which is only going to help you expand. So I couldn't agree with you more, Ron. That's great stuff. So how can people connect with you?
So my office phone number, if anyone wants to call or talk, it's area code 561-720-2417. My email is rherman@rhlawfl.com, which is RHERMAN@rhlawfl.com. My website is rhlawfl.com. Happy for anyone to take a look. Like I said, I have significant community involvement, outreach, professional organizations. I'm happy to connect with anyone who's interested.
Sounds good, Ron. And I'll be sure to link all that up in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much.